Commonwealth Studies is the study of the Commonwealth's history, institutions, member states and people.
The only academic institute in the world dedicated to Commonwealth Studies is under review, raising questions about the future of this work.
This critical conversation and open forum will bring together leading voices from academia, policy and civil society.
By joining this forum alongside your fellow audience members and expert guests, you now have a chance to influence the conversation on the meaning and the future of Commonwealth Studies.
Together, you will explore three key questions. What should Commonwealth Studies mean today, and why should it matter?
What are the most important issues that could be dealt with under the umbrella of Commonwealth Studies?
Could the Commonwealth, its member states and its institutions benefit from a think tank dedicated to Commonwealth Studies?
And if so, what might that look like?
Delivered in partnership with the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and the Association of Commonwealth Universities. This open forum is a chance to voice your views on Commonwealth Studies and shape the form it may take into the future. Welcome.
Welcome.
Welcome, and thank you for joining this critical conversation.
Hello and a warm welcome to our critical conversation. Thank you to each and every one of you for joining us from right around the Commonwealth. I'm Danny Sinha and I'm going to be guiding you through our critical conversation today. Now, we are here today to talk about the future of Commonwealth Studies. There's been huge interest in this event, with over 1,800 registrations from over 60 countries. That would suggest we have plenty to discuss. Now, as we just saw in the video, the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London is the only academic institute in the world dedicated to studying the Commonwealth. Now, earlier this year, the future of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London was called into question. Now, to say this caused a stir is quite an understatement. Certainly, it triggered an outpouring of discussion and debate about what Commonwealth Studies means or should mean for this unique organisation of 54 countries representing 2.4 billion people. Now, a committee chaired by Sir Malcolm Rifkind has been established by the University of London to consider and advise on the future of Commonwealth Studies at the university. And it will be reporting in the next few months, and the outcome of this open forum will feed into the committee's report. So there's never been a better time to get your views heard. But today we're answering much bigger questions about Commonwealth Studies, indeed its meaning, its relevance. And of course, the study of the Commonwealth is by no means confined to London. University departments right across the world investigate colonial histories and legacies, the member states of the Commonwealth and relations between them, and the languages, literatures and cultures that can be said to make up the Commonwealth. Such is that tapestry. So how exactly should Commonwealth Studies be defined, and what should be its purpose? Well, as a television news journalist myself and someone who spent years working in world news, I'm delighted to moderate this important discussion. Indeed, I believe modern Britain itself is in the process of re-evaluating its own future. There have been so many divisive issues this past year, if you think about it, such as Black Lives Matter, Brexit, statues, and not to forget COVID. And I think only through learning about the past, we can then learn about our future. Diversity is something I feel passionately about, so it's a great pleasure to be amongst such a diverse and talented bunch. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our panel today, who hail from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. So firstly, David Salmon is a journalist and political commentator from Jamaica. A warm welcome to you, David. Dr. Rashmi Gokhale is an Indian student of international animal welfare, ethics and law. Hello to you, Rashmi. Danish Ali Bhutto is an assistant director at the National Assembly of Pakistan. Hello, Danish. And Karen Tandy Peterson is a Commonwealth scholar from South Africa. A warm welcome to all of you there. And for those of you in the audience, thank you so much for being here. And please do take the opportunity to contribute using the Q&A function for comments and questions to the panel. Please give your name and country if you feel comfortable. And just to say, questions and comments are welcome at all times, and they will be retained to feed into our reflections of today's event. And just to say, our audience is encouraged to upvote their questions and comments. Now, just to make you aware, questions and comments entered into the chat function will not be posed to the panel, but they will be documented and submitted to the Committee on the Future of Commonwealth Studies. Now, this event will be structured around 3 key questions. Firstly, what should Commonwealth Studies mean today, and why should it matter? Second, what are the most important issues that could or should be dealt with under the umbrella of Commonwealth Studies? And third, could the Commonwealth benefit from a think tank or similar institution dedicated to Commonwealth Studies? And if so, what might that look like? Well, now that our panel have been introduced, I want to start by asking the first question. What should Commonwealth Studies mean today, and why should it matter? And I wonder if I could just start off by going to you, Karen.
Thank you, Danny. It's a great honor to be participating in today's important conversation, particularly with such esteemed panelists. My PhD research focuses on the impacts and implications of decolonial student-led activism in South Africa and the UK. So I'd like to start with a little background on this, as I feel it's relevant to today's conversation. Last month marked the 6th anniversary of the removal of the statue of British colonialist and slave owner Cecil Rhodes at the University of Cape Town, a man who laid the groundwork for apartheid and who believed that, quote, white people are the finest race in the world. The activism of Rhodes Must Fall signaled a transformational moment that reverberated across the world. Colonial iconography and the hegemony of Eurocentric epistemologies and knowledge production. It found root, as we know, in long-held frustrations at Oxford, while calls to decolonize the academy continue to abound through sister movements and campaigns across Commonwealth universities. Although these movements encompass a multitude of aims and strategies, undergirding them is an attempt to disrupt historical amnesia around imperial legacies, connecting these issues to present-day inequalities. From Canada to Malaysia, New Zealand to India, institutions throughout the Commonwealth are faced with the urgent need to redress historical injustices and their role in reinforcing and reproducing colonial social constructions and hierarchies. In light of this activism, I believe that today's conversation is a critical one. The fact that the only institute in the world dedicated to the study of the Commonwealth's history and institutions is under review signals deep questions around its politics and relevance today. Far from being irrelevant, however, I would argue that never before has Commonwealth Studies been so important. We need to tackle the pressing challenges of global inequalities. And to do this, we need to start with an appreciation of how deep the roots of racism run. Centuries of slavery, genocide, oppression, and exploitation have shaped the DNA of our societies. So in answer to your question, Danny, I would ask, how can we begin to move forward if we don't have an institute that's devoted to the study of this history and its continual impact on today's world?
Thank you, Karen. Well, lots to pick up on that. And I wonder, David, if you have any thoughts about what we've just heard from Karen there.
Absolutely. You see, come next year, Jamaica celebrates 60 years of independence. And throughout the history of our country and the countries in the Commonwealth, we have been impacted by a similar sense of history. And on the point that Karen raised about the idea of tackling injustices, that is at the center of the discussion here. And personally, I believe that the role of Commonwealth Studies is to not only look at how we can tackle historical issues, it is a form of, I would say, intellectual reparations as well. It is also a tool to ensure that we focus on pressing issues affecting not only developed nations, but also the developing countries that are within the Commonwealth, because we have several pressing issues that are taking place locally, and an institution such as this nature specifically designed to facilitate that function due to the composition of its membership.
Thank you, David. And I wonder if you could respond to that, Danish, because as we just heard from David, tackling injustices, but also that idea of intellectual reparations and how Commonwealth Studies could play a part in that. What's your thoughts?
Thank you very much, Danny. And I'm delighted to be part of this panel. Actually, before I go into that, I must say that Commonwealth is one of the most gifted regions with a population of almost 1/3 of the world's population, and over 60% of them being under the age of 30. So it is a young Commonwealth. But then apart from the opportunities, there are a lot of challenges that exist as well. Like when we look at the combined GDP of 53 countries, it is over 10 trillion. Like there are one of the largest economies like United Kingdom and India, but there are Tuvalu and Kiribati, which is the smallest GDPs in the region. So in order to make the most out of this diverse alliances, I think it makes this study even more interesting. Now, if you look at the current situation, which is very important to consider why this Institute of Commonwealth Studies is more important than ever. Like the fact that COVID-19 has led to financial crunch, and hence their point of view is that the institute is under review. I think that is totally baffling to me. The pandemic has obviously exacerbated the situations around the globe. It has badly affected the refugees settlements, particularly women, children, and people of color the most. Injustices have escalated. Discrimination against the minorities has increased because of the effects of pandemic and the ongoing situation. And given the context of racial slurs, discrimination, and inequities against the Black and indigenous people of color, and whatever is happening in Minneapolis with the police against the Black communities and other parts of the world. If we look at the pandemic, inequalities and poverty has risen, global gender gaps has increased, gender-based violence has increased, exploitation of youth and refugees is rampant. Now, if we look at all of that, I believe it makes Commonwealth Studies, especially their key work into topics such as refugee law, post-colonial history, Black British history, and human rights, even more important than ever. Like polarization across the globe is on the rise. Populist and conservative ideologies and leaders are putting democracies at stake, whether it's rightist and conservative governments in Brazil and India, or Donald Trump's term in the United States, or Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. The unfortunate commonality is divisive politics. Now, divisive politics, I would say, is tearing apart harmony and peace across not just Commonwealth, but the entire world. Polarization, and again, undermines independence of judiciary across the Commonwealth. Human rights defenders are demonized, media is gagged, and consequently, democracy is endangered. In a polarized society, I think everyone is a threat to everyone else. Academia and experts, I must say, come to the rescue by presenting a parallel narrative, which is very important because we don't have a counter narrative to polarized ideology and radicalization. In that context, informed policymaking is a must. Instead of considering shutting down institutions, I would say we must not only strengthen existing institutions, but also establish more such institutions that are dedicated to policy-driven research facilitation, teaching and education, and presenting, most importantly, with a counter narrative. Such institutions, I'm sure, will directly feed into the goals of Commonwealth and serve as a catalyst for economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability.
I can hear your passion there, Darish, and it's true, isn't it? Because coronavirus has really divided things and sort of deepened some of those injustices that we've seen all around the world. But that idea of divisive politics and how that's been very much key to the narrative around the world as well, and why perhaps the Commonwealth Studies perhaps has more of a place more than ever. Rashmi, I wonder if you could pick up on some of those ideas.
Hi, Danny, and I cannot agree more with Salman and Danish and Karan. They have pointed out right that Britain and other Commonwealth countries, they have similarities with their human rights, structure of their law and democracy. In fact, I would give a different side to this entire sociological background, that Britain was the first country to recognize the legal rights of animals. So we also need to consider that the United Nations has this agenda by 2030 where they have to, their agenda is sustainable development. So where sustainable development and climate change holds a very high degree of importance, I think that study is also important to be undertaken by the Commonwealth Studies and the universities of Commonwealth. Secondly, most important thing is, I would like to give an example of this. Last week only, the UK Parliament has passed multiple bills, and one of the bills is also, like many of the bills are also about animal welfare. UK has recognized that animals are sentient beings. In India, in 1890, Prevention of Cruelty to Acts was established by Britishers. So post-constitution, post-independence, Prevention of Cruelty to Acts 1960 was formed. But we are still amending it in a little different way. For example, if UK has recognized that animals are sentient beings, we are a step backward where we are still deciding the fee for penalty to cruelty to animals. For example, right now it is just 0.4 British pounds if you are cruel to an animal. So we have to go long way, countries, other Commonwealth countries, and this has to be considered while taking a decision by the authorities.
And I know animal welfare is something that you feel passionately about. I just want to pause for a second because we have got some questions from people who are sending them in. And I'm just going to read this one out first. It's from Anita Sundaraj. And she says, if we are to study the Commonwealth, I would like to study how we can come up with a mechanism where we can share in an equitable manner the fruits of all our labour. Could a subject like Commonwealth Studies encourage or hinder this? And I just wonder, perhaps David, you could pick up on this.
Well, I'd just like to start by saying that is a brilliant question, and I'd like to thank the representative for asking that question. Commonwealth Studies can absolutely facilitate that opportunity, and here's why. Within the Commonwealth, we see a kaleidoscope of nations that do extremely well in the international system and that are coming along on the international system. This facilitates the opportunities for persons and nations to learn from each other, because we are a global community. We are all learning from each other, from our strengths, our weaknesses, our successes, and our failures. So to answer your question succinctly, absolutely, because it facilitates a mechanism where the transfer of ideas can take place. So for example, as a journalist from Jamaica, I not only look at issues and looking at how to solve Jamaican issues from a Jamaican perspective, I may take a perspective from another nation and transfer it here locally. I have mentioned successes that Australia has done in terms of its public policy and its administration and how we can learn from that. I have very good discussions with my colleagues from India and Tanzania. Currently, one of my friends who I've met through the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, we're writing a paper together on foreign policy. So we see how, because of the mechanism that exists within the Commonwealth, it can facilitate that exchange of ideas. So to answer your question, Commonwealth Studies can achieve what the question would have asked, and it can do it because of the unique composition of its membership and nation states.
Okay, Thank you very much for that, David. I'm just going to bring another question in. This one's from Caroline Sawyer. I'm not sure where she's from, but anyway, this is the question. What is the generally unifying factor of common law? The way that the different systems develop and are abused in parallel will be a really good source of academic discussion and scholarship. So what is the unifying factor of common law? Danish, have you got any thoughts about that?
Thank you very much, Danny. It's another important question. When it comes to unifying forces, I believe the dynamics of the entire Commonwealth and the shared past is something that makes it a unifying factor. And then apart from that, if you look at the Commonwealth and then Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and the Commonwealth Learning, so these are three very important factors. I believe strengthening parliaments means strengthening democracies across the world. And this is one of the most advocated values of the Commonwealth. And what Commonwealth Parliamentary Association does is like bringing together almost 180 legislatures, regional and federal legislatures from across the 54 countries at one platform. So when you are bringing people together, so parliamentary diplomacy gets the boost. And there are many important things which otherwise cannot be achieved through the intergovernmental level diplomacy that can be achieved by the interparliamentary diplomacy, and which has happened in the past. There have been instances of such achievements. So with that particular formulation and the setup where you have governments on one hand, you have parliament on another, and then you have academia or institutions such as this in the center. Now, one very important challenge that the Commonwealth countries face today is not lack of legislation, but it is proper implementation of legislation. So this is where the role of Commonwealth institution comes in. They can come up with their studies as to what are the loopholes and gaps existing in the existing policies and legislation across the Commonwealth countries, and they can come up with the proposed solutions to that. And that can lead to improving their livelihoods and the overall situation of people, not just in the developing and underdeveloped countries, but also the developed countries where we can see that nowadays this polarization and racial profiling is on the rise. So I believe it's the composition of entire Commonwealth and its allied institutions that makes it crucial to work in coordination and try to resolve the global challenges.
Really, really good point there, Danish. I want to get on to this other good question, because this one comes from Peter Williams in the UK. You've talked about the implementation. Let's get down to money though, because as he says, if the members of the panel believe that Commonwealth studies should be given greater visibility, do they think this can be achieved without public funding? And if such funding is required, what would the source and through what coordinating mechanism would the funding be provided? So where does the money come from? Karen, how about you? Any thoughts?
Wow, that's a big question. Yeah, and a really important one. I don't quite know. All I can say is that it would need to come from and the money to fund it. We need to face the fact that this association and the study of this association and this history is premised on unequal relations of power. And resources and access to those resources. And so I would say that it needs to start with that kind of conversation. So yes, public funds, definitely, because many of the public institutions, particularly in the UK, are funded from legacies of empire and of slavery. So I think that does call for access from those funds. Yes, so I would say certainly, but I understand that it's a tricky one to face. Yeah.
It's a tricky question to answer, but you did that eloquently. So thank you very much, Karen. I am going to move on to our next question, which is our second question. And that is, what are the most important issues that could be dealt with under the umbrella of Commonwealth Studies. And I wonder if I could go first now to Rashmi and get your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And being from the field of climate change and animal welfare, I think I would start from that. We all are facing this pandemic, and we are reading about the news of what is the cause and what is the cause of the spread of this pandemic. It's a high time to invest in or fund projects related to climate change. Secondly, under the umbrella of Commonwealth Studies, there are multiple issues, to study or do an empirical analysis. Procedural policy making in a lot of issues are required. I'll give one small example with the stray dog population in India. I'm sure it's a current, as per the 2016 survey, the population is around 30 million. We do have good policies in place. We have animal birth control rules. We have pet practitioner rules. But as Danish said somewhere, implementation is the part. It's not about only making the policy. It is about reviewing your own policy and finding out the flaws and go with the procedure. So yes, my focus would be climate change. Of course, there are many other areas like sociology, human rights, but I think we humans are far more blessed than other non-human species and the environment.
I mean, climate change is one of those big issues that we're all having. Each nation is now having to think about. And Danish, I wonder if that is one of the things that you think that the Commonwealth Studies really needs to get behind.
I agree with her on the point of climate change is being one of the most important priorities of not just the Commonwealth, but academic institutions as well. But in addition to that, there are other important and pressing challenges as well, including violent extremism, translational terrorism, regional conflicts, and most importantly, global health crisis that we are going through. And not just that, if you look at the recent situation in Palestine and human rights violation, Jammu and Kashmir, and whatever is happening in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So these are some of the challenges that the humanity faces. And these are, I would say, tipping points and pose as the most serious threat to regional as well as global peace and prosperity. And obviously, Commonwealth is not immune to such threats. Over the years, Commonwealth has obviously proven crucial in promoting unity and providing for a concrete framework for regional cooperation for development, human rights protection, and strengthening democracies across the Commonwealth. But then, if you look at the Commonwealth Studies, Institute of Commonwealth Studies, if it's vibrant and empowered, I think it can serve as its core, as a core of the Commonwealth organization, as well as the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and which it can serve as the edifice of democracy, and regional prosperity can stand and thrive on that. If you look at the other priorities, it could be to foster the Commonwealth shared values of democracy, gender equality, sustainable development, international peace and security by expanding its scope and introducing such programs, because they are already introducing and programs like human rights and refugee and some other Commonwealth studies as well. But as she mentioned, climate change, I would say, in addition to climate change, there are other priorities in the sustainable development goals as well that the research in the Institute of Commonwealth Studies can focus on, especially gender equality, because it feeds into at least 8 to 10 other goals as well. Unless gender equality is achieved, other goals cannot be achieved. So it is very important to prioritize that as well.
Karen, I could see you nodding to a lot of what Danish was saying, particularly when he was mentioning human rights, democracy. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I completely agree with what's been said. I mean, I think that all of these issues are incredibly pertinent and important to focus on. I mean, if we look at climate change, the countries that are going to be most affected by it have contributed the least. throughout the African continent. It's a pertinent issue, and it really does need to be dealt with. You know, the Commonwealth encompasses some of the biggest and the smallest, the richest and the poorest countries. So we need to take account of these vast inequalities and polarizations. And then, of course, the pandemic has, shown inequalities with public access to healthcare. We have an apartheid that's been developed around the vaccines and access to the vaccinations. And so I think that this also needs to be dealt with. Certainly human rights, gender inequity, these are issues that need to be faced and confronted. And we need to look at the power structures and the histories that have contributed to these legacies today. So I think that all of these issues are incredibly important.
David, if I can take some of those comments to you, apartheid with vaccines, just what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's a pressing issue. As you would know, I come from Jamaica, which is an island of 3 million people. And we are fundamentally affected by climate change, by vaccine inequalities, by long-standing issues surrounding slavery. So if you're looking at a mechanism to facilitate development, then this is it. And that has to be at the core of the study of Commonwealth Studies, pressing issues looking at development. I find it interesting that the question was raised about funding and all of this, but the real question that should be raised is why not? We always look at funding and say, okay, let's see how we can cut corners here. And at the end of the day, if, for example, we don't provide support to smaller countries, you may get a mutation of a virus, and then the vaccine that was invested in is no longer effective. So we like to look at these issues almost in a dichotomous way, in this black and white sort of issue, and not look at the fact that all of these issues are integrated. If a country is going through particular challenges with governance and it leads to economic migrants, they're coming to Europe, they're coming to North America. All right. If we are seeing where there is a lack of technology transfer taking place among different Commonwealth countries, then they're going to get it from developing countries. So the issues that you see take place in some of these nations can be solved by directly investing in them through intellectual transfer that was mentioned earlier, through targeted focus on development issues. And that's where we need to go, looking at a collective, wholesome picture and not be bogged down in the whole nationalistic rhetoric that is taking place. Because at the end of the day, an issue that happens out here in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, it's going to affect the UK eventually. It's going to affect the United States eventually. So let's come together as a former German chancellor would say, a basket, or a lifeboat. I believe Chancellor Willy Brandt, he may have mentioned it, a basket for the world. So that's where we need to go going forward.
Okay, great comment. Okay, I'm going to bring in some of the comments then and questions from the audience. This is from Neil Blackshaw. He says, another issue is that of rapid and uncontrolled urbanisation. 8 out of 10 of the riskiest cities are in India. Does the panel agree that we need to find radical insights as to how this can be addressed? And it makes sense to go to you, Rashmi. What are your thoughts?
We in developing countries, or forget about developing or developed countries, but development is something that is going to happen. I mean, one cannot say that because we are affecting the climate, we are not going to develop. No country is going to accept that. The important point is how we do it sustainably. So of course there are projects. For example, yesterday there was a cyclonic storm in Mumbai, Taukte, and it eroded around 600 trees in Mumbai. So I read this nice article which says that how scientific tree trimming is important to prevent this. So everything goes back to planning. Again, I am influencing on procedural policy making and subject-specific empirical analysis of that system to understand which factors in the urbanization can have positive impact and which will have negative impact. There are many organizations, non-governmental organizations working on sustainable urbanization projects, and you can find that information online for that.
Okay, well, hopefully that will answer Neil's question. I'm going to move on to Arif Zaman. He writes in, how can Commonwealth Studies drive more internationalism in teaching and research in international business, which too often uses a northern perspective with a peppering of references to a few developing countries? I wonder if I could put that to you. Karen, you're nodding.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very important question. I mean, similarly to what I said before, Commonwealth Studies has to interrogate the injustices of the past and the ways in which they are perpetuated today. That is the only way that we are going to move forward. These are the conditions that sustain racial and gender inequity, and it's how we can subvert them. But if we look at how, I mean, so many institutions are taking these steps. So we have UCL, it's looking at its history of propagating its actions in the development of eugenics. Glasgow University, it's launched a reparative justice program. It discovered it benefited tens of millions of pounds from slavery. Cambridge has launched a 2-year study into the extent to which it benefited from slavery. All of these projects signal the importance of this. And I certainly think that, you know, the fact that South African universities are taking a look at how important it is to Africanize and indigenize its frameworks, its discourses, and the culture of its institutions, I think this is a really important starting point. And I think that it depends on the context for the institution, but certainly to question Northern Hemisphere frameworks is very important, and to bring an international perspective to these discussions. And we've just seen how liberational and you know, it brings forth, it puts forth the voices of those who are most exploited in these conversations and provides them with that agency. So I think it's a really incredible process to be followed.
Okay, this one comes from Kuram Khan. Is it not possible to shift Commonwealth Studies module to dedicated universities with a unit within Commonwealth Secretariat for Coordination? Danish, I wonder if you've got any thoughts about that.
Oh, thank you, Danny, for the question. I believe it is always okay to have more options, but that doesn't mean that we should kind of get rid of focused institutions. It is important to have focused institutions as well, because that is where the most important issues can be taken. And then they are the ones who can lead that narrative and the entire studies on the Commonwealth Studies. And obviously they can work in collaboration and coordination with other institutions who can introduce such programs as well. So that would be my brief answer to that.
Now, I'm going to bring this one in from Sharon Didier. She says, how can the Commonwealth build equity into the institution so that member states see the value of representation from the group in an era of distrust in institutions? So picking up on that distrust in institutions and building equity and parity. Could I come to you for that, David?
All right, so to answer the question, what we need is to look at facilitating opportunities. If you're not going to, for example, have conflict with the person you're going to do business with. You're not going to have a conflict with the person who is providing scholarship opportunities or investment. So what we need to look at is providing meaningful opportunities for people, not just necessarily looking at tokenism, because we have had enough of that. You know, we've had these sorts of exchanges, we're looking at development, quote unquote, but you need to look at how you can provide meaningful opportunities. So for example, we see where the Commonwealth provides several scholarships for persons to study in the UK, but over the years, we see where the number of scholarships to developing countries have been reduced over time. That is something that can be corrected in order to build equity in the system, providing more opportunities going forward. We also see, for example, where there's a lot of this focus is also on the United Kingdom. However, we can facilitate for that knowledge and learning from different countries outside of the UK, so we can learn the successes outside. So for example, studying in institutions in New Zealand or Australia or India or Sri Lanka or South Africa. So it's really through providing opportunities, which is how you correct historical distrust and inequity in a system. Because when you provide opportunities and for that knowledge to transfer, then you start to see where there's going to be greater collaboration, improve standard of living for people, and ultimately we'll build a better society.
Okay, Sham, provided better opportunities. That's so says David anyway. And now let's go now to the next question, which is, here we go, technical vocational education and training, especially for agricultural production and a green environment, is needed in Bangladesh. This one comes from Biplab from Bangladesh. And I wonder if I could go to Rashmi for that question.
Sorry, but can you repeat the question?
Of course. So Biplab from Bangladesh says technical, vocational education and training, especially for agricultural production and a green environment, is what's needed in Bangladesh.
Yes, Viplav, I think it is also needed in India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, our neighboring countries, Nepal. You know, the Southeast Asian regions, if you compare the law of countries like USA and UK with the agricultural production law of Southeast Asian countries, you'll see that the 5 freedoms of the animals are somewhere not included in the law structure. And if we are going to take some produce from the animal, it is our responsibility to keep the animal in a good state of welfare. So I cannot agree more with you that like Bangladesh, I think most of the Southeast Asian countries need to review their law on agricultural production.
Okay, interesting. I'm just going to ask this question because it comes from Nizovu, and he says, what about issues of some marginalized and vulnerable groups who include sexual minorities? I think these group needs should be taken into account, including decriminalization in most Commonwealth countries. More studies and research should be conducted because there's not enough data on sexual minorities. Karen, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a pertinent question. I mean, just thinking about the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa and the General Fawless movement, it was led by Black queer women. And I think this is a very important issue. It was not just about institutional racism, it was certainly about queer issues at these universities and how they have been perpetuated and how they've been ignored in histories of struggle in South Africa. So I think that more and more this is coming to the fore, and I certainly think it is an important issue and something that I do think is being tackled by many countries across the Commonwealth. So yeah, I think it's an important one to focus on.
Danish, you hail from Pakistan. What are your thoughts? What are some of the issues from Pakistan in relation to that question about making sure that some marginalized and vulnerable groups, including sexual minorities, perhaps homosexual groups, feel that they need to be represented? Is there still a problem there?
It is still a problem, and that obviously ascribes to the social and cultural and religious dynamics in the country. But if we talk about marginalization of minorities or vulnerable groups, I would believe that nobody would deny the fact that nobody deserves to be discriminated because of their background or where they come from. And UN human rights covenants and all the conventions also guarantee the rights. And since you asked question about Pakistan, Pakistani constitution also advocates non-discrimination. But then there are some cultural and social sensitivities, and there is still a problem in that particular context.
David, you hail from Jamaica, and not only that, you're a journalist and political commentator. Again, let's look at those decriminalisation in most Commonwealth countries, and should that happen when it comes to sexual minorities? And I wonder if you've got a take on that as well.
All right, so it's a very relevant question, and I'd like to build on what Danny should have said, where we see across the Commonwealth, there is a respect for human rights and decency. So for example, our Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms does not allow for the discrimination of anyone. As he had mentioned, it is a cultural issue, and what we must understand or appreciate is that as culture evolves, so does values. So the best way to facilitate the evolution of values is to encourage these sorts of partnerships and these sorts of exchanges where we're discussing these matters, because once we can discuss these matters in a free and open forum, then you can see persons will be more willing to accept it. Additionally, what you could also look at is looking at how you can facilitate opportunities to learn in other nations, because you wouldn't necessarily know how to advocate for something unless you know or see it be taking place in another nation as well. So again, it illustrates the importance of the Commonwealth, especially for having shared values of decency and respect. And once we establish the principles of decency and respect across the board, then we would see progress being made.
Okay, thank you for that. Shared values. I also want to pick up on this point, because this would indicate there's perhaps shared issues. And this comes from Ian Douglas. He says, we must recognise the interconnectedness of issues: poverty, COVID-19, climate changes, biodiversity, loss, human rights. They're all interlinked. We need institutions that will look at what is happening now and what we will leave to our grandchildren. So that idea of perhaps having a lot of commonality. Danish, to you.
You are totally right. Where we celebrate commonalities and shared values, we also have shared challenges and similar challenges when it comes to most of the countries in the Commonwealth. In that particular context, I believe the beauty and diversity of the Commonwealth lies in the fact that there are some of the largest economies, as I earlier mentioned, and some of the poorest economies part of this Commonwealth forum. So that's where the global goal on supporting the underdeveloped countries and developed countries by the developed countries comes in. When you come together on a single platform, whether it's the Parliamentary Association or the Forum of the governments, Commonwealth governments. So that is where you bring together all the shared challenges and ideas, and you talk about them and come to the common ground and find solutions to the problems which are most pressing, and you prioritize those issues. And that's where the resources from the richest countries can be provided through aid to the poorest countries, and they can be supported not just in terms of monetary resources and financial resources, but in terms of intellectual resources as well. And Institute of Commonwealth Studies and other such institutions can prove instrumental in that regard, and ensuring that the policies are empirically evidence-based and not just made in silos and maybe copy-pasted from some other country and that replicate in your own respective countries. And obviously the result is they are less effective and implementation, because you don't keep in consideration the local context. So institutions such as these and academia, inputs by the academia, can help resolve those challenges.
Which leads nicely into this next question, which comes from Johansson from Kenya. Does Commonwealth embrace open access and diversity, equality and inclusivity in the research ecosystem? He says, coming from Africa, access to African research is a challenge because of ownership. So publishing in high impact journals not hosted in Africa and hidden behind paywalls. How do we make African research in the Commonwealth countries openly and freely accessible, visible? If I could come to you, David.
All right, so that's a very brilliant question. It's something that I have had to face as a student. Looking at I see an article, it's a very good article. I look, oh wait, I can't access the article. All right, so that is a very pressing matter that should be addressed, and that should be addressed by encouraging opportunities for people to write. So for example, the Roundtable is a journal that facilitates opportunities for Commonwealth writers to submit pieces, and you would have seen that publications would have come from different young persons across the world in this publication. So in terms of addressing those issues, we're not being able to facilitate knowledge and not being able to access information. That's why you have to promote mechanisms where you yourself have a stake in it. And in the Commonwealth, we have a stake in it because they're equal nations in this organization. Now, since we have established that we're equal nations in this organization, you promote institutions that build that stake. So for example, journals that promote the studies on sustainable development, or as Rashmi would have said, animal rights, that should be facilitated because it is she herself, as well as persons from her country, have a stake in the process. So it really starts from accepting ownership of it, contributing to the development of the institutions, and facilitating opportunities where persons can come together, pool their resources, have a body of knowledge coming together in institutions, whether it's through the round table or whether it's an institution with that studies, Commonwealth studies particularly, but it has to start from there.
Okay, and would you agree with that, Karen? Do you think the Commonwealth provides those sort of opportunities?
Well, absolutely, I agree with everything that David has said. I mean, I think that it's a very pertinent issue. I think that unequal power relations between Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere scholars continues to be perpetuated. And we need to look at the practices of publishing and research and access to these journals, exactly as David has said. And I think that, picking up on something that you said earlier, David, you would talk about we need to shy away from tokenism in these questions. We need to be prepared to ask the difficult, the provocative, the hard questions and do that work. And look at how our institutions reinforce unequal access to power, to opportunities, and to knowledge. So I think it's a very important one. I don't think that Commonwealth Studies is there yet, but I think that more and more it is being addressed.
I also wonder if I could just bring this other question, because obviously mental health has been a real issue wherever you are in the world with coronavirus, and there's a lot been going on this year. And this one comes from Kartik. They say, I belong to a country which is a member of the Commonwealth Foundation. Most of the Commonwealth countries do not have a mental health institution. As part of the Commonwealth studies, what are the thoughts of the panelists on encouraging these countries into conducting research and establishing mental health institutions? Rashmi, I wonder if you've got any thoughts about
that. I don't come from the mental health background as such, but of course, with the pandemic right now in place, mental health is a huge concern when most of the metropolitan population is working from home and they are isolated. There is no contact as such with outside world or environment. Having a institution focused on mental health is going to help in development of all other areas of work. For example, someone just pointed out that all these issues are interconnected. So having a good mental health is a key to working well in all those issues. But I would definitely defer it to some expert panelist who has experience in it.
I don't know if anybody else, but I suppose we all, from some shape or form, have seen how our individual countries have been affected, I guess, by the pandemic, and with that, I guess, is that mental health question. Danish, have you got any thoughts?
I would comment on the policy side of the mental health issue. You are totally right. One of the most affected area after this pandemic has been the mental health. And if I talk about Pakistan, there's a huge stigma attached to mental health. People don't consider it as an illness that is considered for, suppose, being away from the religion. It is considered a deviant behavior. It is considered sometimes as being possessed by some force. So and then when you don't even acknowledge that, obviously you resort to solutions that are non-scientific, and you resort to solutions which are like suggested by the quacks. These quacks can be charlatans, can be religious, or they can be, in our country we call them Neem Hakim, which is like not a doctor but pretending to be a doctor. So that is what happens, and people resolve for spiritual guidance in those particular contexts. And then in most of the cases, the situation even worsens. by the treatment, by the alleged treatment these people get from these people. So when I talk about Pakistan, in that particular context, there is a sense of acknowledgement and realization on the policy fronts. There have been many parliamentarians, especially women parliamentarians, who have brought forth some of the legislation to ensure that there are some free toll-free numbers for psychological and mental health related help. There have been many NGOs who are working on promoting mental health education and making people believe that this is something real. And there are some foundations also which are working on awareing people on the hazards of ignoring and overlooking mental health. So some work has definitely been done around, but obviously there's a lot that needs to be done.
Absolutely. It sounds like there's some progress made, certainly in Pakistan, and by some shape or form. I just wondered if I could bring this one in as well. This one comes from Ramesh in India. How to accommodate multilingualism in Commonwealth studies. If we keep English as the only language of education, we are putting 90% of the potential beneficiaries out of the radar. David, have you got any thoughts about that?
Yes, I do actually. It's a very relevant question. I kind of chuckled because I come from an English-speaking country. We speak English. We have our own Creole language. But because of my interactions with the Commonwealth Youth Parliament, I had met some person from Tanzania, which is in East Africa. And I said, okay, it's probably would be neat to learn another language. So I started to learn Tanzanian from my interactions with her. Well, not Tanzanian, sorry, Swahili, from my interactions with her. And then we have a whole group of us that she's teaching me all the languages and such. So I thought that was such an interesting and relevant question. You see, we have to appreciate the indigenous nature of the Commonwealth, and that starts with language. I was reading an article that was published by the BBC over the weekend, which had highlighted that several Africans living on the continent don't feel attached to their native communities because of this emphasis on English. So I think you had even cited persons from South Africa who I remember it was quite vivid. One young lady said she couldn't speak to her grandmother, who I believe speaks Xhosa, I think is the language, because of that emphasis on English. So we have to go and appreciate that. I think certainly if we're going to be looking at reviewing Commonwealth studies, we have to ensure that we can facilitate the different language exchanges taking place. I certainly think that that's why you should, for example, facilitate research opportunities in these countries that you can learn these languages. All right, so you can have an indigenous experience. So certainly broaden it from English was very important. If we're a globalized society, it cannot be globalized around the English language. It has to be globalized around the uniqueness that we all have to offer. And certainly once we accept that and we can appreciate that, we can move going forward.
Would you agree with that, Karen, that there's been too much focus on English in the past and it's time to open things out a bit?
Absolutely. I think David put it perfectly. We are in South Africa, we have 11 official languages, of which we are very proud to have. But I'm ashamed to admit that I speak very few of them, as do most white South Africans. Although I grew up in Chicago, most of my white South African friends and family members do not speak most of the indigenous languages of this country, although Black South Africans do. And this is a huge issue. And it was certainly raised during the Roads Must Fall movement and the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa. And it continues to play out at universities throughout the country. And they are responding to this. They are looking at different ways. And I think it's forcing them to be imaginative and creative in their responses. And it's generating really interesting, rich conversations that are really addressing these power dynamics that play in language. So I think it's something that is really just beginning to be addressed. But I think it holds amazing potential.
Well, we'll look to David and his Swahili next. Well, let's pause there because it's time now to look at the third and final question to the panel. Could the Commonwealth, so its member states and its institutions, benefit from a think tank dedicated to Commonwealth studies? And if so, what might that look like? Big question. Who should we go to first? I think we'll go to Danish and get your thoughts about that.
Thank you, Danny. I find it ironic that Commonwealth has sometimes been criticized for being a post-colonial club, and there has been instances where countries have chosen to leave Commonwealth because of that particular reason. So I would say this is where the role of academia and Commonwealth studies can potentially prove instrumental, because if Commonwealth studies and such other institutions promulgate the Commonwealth's shared vision of developmental support and cooperation on international goals, then obviously that particular sense of being a post-colonial club can be driven away. And then divisive politics, rising polarization, and then through these counter narratives, adoption of unifying ideologies through research and education can be made. Coming to the question that how can Commonwealth benefit from a think tank dedicated to Commonwealth studies? Now, if you look at the current collaborators on this particular event, there's Commonwealth Foundation, there's Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and there's Association of Universities. Association of Commonwealth Universities, which is like 500 member universities. Commonwealth Parliamentary Association has 180 member legislatures from across the Commonwealth regions. So if this particular consortium supports Institute of Commonwealth Studies in establishing a think tank, which will, I would say, would be just like a CPA, an interparliamentary union, are parliaments of parliaments. So this can be a think tank of think tanks, because if I refer to the example from Pakistan, we have very vibrant Pakistan Institute for Parliamentary Services, which is sort of a think tank to the parliament, both houses of the parliament, and they support parliamentarians in providing research and other support. So when such a think tank is established, it can collaborate with those parliamentary institutions from all the branches of the parliaments, especially to ensure that the policy making that is being culminated is informed and evidence-based and not just made in silos. So, and then these institutions within those national parliaments and national regions, they are also collaborating. And again, I'll share example from Pakistan, that Pakistan has established memorandum of understanding with the academic institutions, specialized academic institutions, and linked them through Pakistan Institute of Parliamentary Services and the standing committees and parliamentary committees of the parliament. So they provide them with the informed input as to what policies could be prioritized, where are some of the loopholes in the existing policies that can be amended, and what are the most pressing issues on not just local fronts, but international front and policy making as well. So I believe this think tank of think tanks can prove instrumental in achieving the goals of Commonwealth as well as international development goals, because policy making is, I believe, at the heart of strengthening democracy and rule of law across the regions. Thank you.
Do you think, David, that it could be a positive thing as well to have a think tank of think tanks, as we heard there from Danish? Could that be instrumental in looking at Commonwealth studies and how things should be implemented?
Yes, well, I'd like to start by answering by saying Asante Sana, which is Swahili for thank you very much. And I absolutely think it can be relevant because of the unique nature of it, but it has to be facilitated with reforms. So as Danesh would have said, a think tank of think tanks needs to operate in different locations beyond the United Kingdom. So for example, if we are going to be facilitating for that intellectual transfer of knowledge and for that exchange, we need to have, for example, a center in Africa so that our African brothers and sisters can go and study there. If we're going to be looking at having a think tank and that we're going to be focusing on issues of Southern Asia, we have to have an institution in Southern Asia, whether it's Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or India or Pakistan or any of those nations. So I absolutely think it's quite important that we look at how we can achieve this objective, but it has to be facilitated through reforms. It also has to be facilitated with accessibility. So for example, it's quite expensive to go to the United Kingdom, for argument, or to go to a country like Australia or South Africa. So we need to look at how we can make travel cheaper in this globalized environment. We also have to look at producing tangible benefits as well. So for example, if we are looking at the technological transfer, that has to be a two-way stream as well, looking at how innovations in the UK or innovations in India can also impact innovations that may take place in Kenya, for example, looking at how we can facilitate that cross-border exchange as well. So I think an institution, a think tank dedicated to Commonwealth Studies is absolutely important in order for it to be effective and to facilitate the seamless implementation of such an idea. It has to have different locations across the world, and it has to look at how we can facilitate that sort of intellectual exchanges, or at least to facilitate for us to learn different languages to communicate in.
Okay, David, very impressive Swahili. Can I move to you, Karen, then? So this idea of benefiting from a think tank dedicated to Commonwealth studies, do you think that would be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, again, David put it beautifully there. I think that it certainly, if it were to exist, it would need to be localized. I think that's a really important point, or to have local chapters. But, I was thinking when thinking about this question, I was remembering my first few months in the UK when I arrived as a Commonwealth scholar. And I was invited to this welcome event in London with students from dozens of countries across the Commonwealth. And it really represented the rich and impressive diversity of this phenomenal association. It was a deeply moving and humbling experience for me, and something that I have thought of often. But it wasn't only a welcome gathering, it was also about including us in a discussion on some of the most critical issues affecting the Commonwealth today, from gender and equity, as we've discussed, human rights and justices, global inequalities, climate change, the protection of the environment. So to have the space to come together and rigorously debate these issues and even find potential solutions, it was a powerful experience. And I think it signaled to me that a think tank dedicated to Commonwealth studies would be profoundly beneficial. However, a caveat should be attached to this, that this think tank, if it's to be effective, it needs to address the power dynamics shaping this shared history and the shared traditions that bind us. And we need to address how this is perpetuated throughout the Commonwealth. I also want to reflect on the fact that, I am a white South African, and I am called to continually confront my own complicity in the perpetuation of racist legacies and power structures. South Africa's violent history of colonialism and apartheid has fostered a legacy of trauma, and we were talking about mental health, the impacts of mental health. This impacts society at every level today. So through my research and my involvement in organizations such as the Association of Commonwealth Universities, the Peace and Reconciliation Network, I have been able to glimpse what such a think tank could look like. And I believe it could play a powerful role in repairing legacies of trauma, dispossession, and violence that continue today.
Okay, beautifully put. We haven't heard from you, Rashmi. I just wondered what your thoughts are about this idea of having a think tank dedicated to Commonwealth studies.
David and Danish have spoken about think tanks of think tanks. I will narrow it down to a subject-specific think tank. So let us try.
I think we're having a few problems with your audio, so if that's just your, oh, hang on, you're moving again. Yeah. Do you want to try again? Sorry.
I was saying that Danish and David has focused on think tanks of think tanks, but I narrow it down specifically to a subject-specific think tank. For example, of course, it is very important to have regional think tanks, but it is very important to have think tanks based on the agenda. Suppose we have identified 10 pressive events to be addressed for next 5 years. Then for each event, for example, one of the event could be ending rabies, the disease transmitted from animals to humans through dog bite. If you want to end the human deaths of rabies by 2030, how beautifully the tri-party organizations like Food Agricultural Organization, Animal Health Organization, and World Health Organization have come together. They have identified the importance of One Health in maintaining the public health. We need policymakers, policy advisors, the field workers who are going to implement the policies, and the academia involved in that subject specific think tank and act accordingly.
So that's interesting, that idea of looking at individual issues. Here's another one then from Madurama. They say a focus on issues is relevant to various sustainable development goals so that there is a measure to trace and track development in achieving the goals of various Commonwealth nations. This would inform governments as well as enable prioritisation of areas for the work of the Commonwealth Secretariat. David, would you agree?
Absolutely. It's an economic principle that when you specialize on a specific area, you achieve expertise in that area. So dedicating specific interest to focus to specific areas of the Sustainable Development Goals would certainly go a long way in ensuring that we become specialists in these areas. So for example, as Danish would have highlighted, the idea of public policy. Public policy is quite important because you can look at your policy and see how it impacts different areas. So how it impacts mental health, how it may impact animal welfare, how it may impact democracy or social justice. So for example, if we're going to look at focusing that, we can focus on public policy and see how we can get effective policies, effective monitoring and evaluation mechanisms to ensure that these policies and achieving the SDGs are successful. If, for example, we are going to be looking at facilitating greater educational opportunities for persons, that's SDG number 4, we can look at how we can specialize in those areas, look at what works in other countries, what may work in other countries, what may not, and see how we can learn. So specialization is always encouraged, especially when you want to become an expert in a particular area, and I would happily encourage it.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, David. I just want to go to you now, Karen. I've just got this comment now from Daisy Cooper. So, on think tanks, let us not repeat what too often happens in the Commonwealth in not learning from institutional memory and from past experiences and applying their lessons. So what worked and what did not work and why when the Commonwealth Policy Studies Unit was operating? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely important. I mean, you know, so often reports and commissions are held and the same thing is said over and over again and very little action is taken. So whilst a think tank is important, it's critical that it's premised on what has worked and what hasn't worked, and that it takes real action to deliver on whatever it finds in discussing these issues, particularly when it's about specific subjects, as we've said, the importance of that. So yeah, I think that's really important, and I do think that is a risk that often comes up in these kinds of organizations.
Okay. Now, just got this comment from Beth Bruder. She says, she's from Canada. So she says, here in Canada, my experience is the Commonwealth does not have a high enough profile. The values are strong, but do not reach the broader Canadian audience. Is there a strategy in the works that will uplift the Commonwealth goals? And could a think tank help this? Danish, what have you got your thoughts about
that? That's exactly what I earlier mentioned. So I really appreciate this question, that there have been misperceptions and sometimes right perceptions about Commonwealth. There have been some goals that haven't been achieved so far, but then it is an evolving organization because it didn't have its constitution for many years until almost a decade ago. So obviously it is an evolving institution, and with a think tank at its beck and call are in order to support the policies and agendas and prioritize areas of cooperation for the Commonwealth organization as well as Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. I believe it will really help in achievement of the goals of goals, as well as upholding the values of Commonwealth. Because the main issue here is to prioritize and identify areas of cooperation, and how it can then respond to those particular pressing challenges that can be maybe in a group of countries, or some issue in a specific country, just like say Jammu and Kashmir, our Palestinian issue. So that can pose as a threat to global peace and prosperity. So it can then prioritize and try to resolve those issues and bring them to the agenda. And at the back end, obviously, an institute such as Commonwealth Institute or a think tank would prove instrumental and valuable in that regard.
And I think that's what, Rashmi, you were saying a little time ago as well. I just want this comment now in from Gibson. He says, why hasn't the Commonwealth been as active as other international organisations such as the UN, APEC? Karen, is that your take on things as well, or how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to the as it could be, and it perhaps, I wonder how much of that is to do with the lack of really addressing the history and the dynamics and the power structures that shape it. So perhaps it is time to have a confrontation with these kinds of questions, and to address them in a real way, and not to tokenize them. And I think that perhaps that might make it a much more relevant organization for today's world in terms of being premised on a more radical and liberational politics.
David, radical politics, where do you stand on that?
Where I stand in terms of radical policies, or where I stand in terms of the activity of the Commonwealth?
Well, the activity of the Commonwealth.
All right, so I think we have to look at certain issues here. So the firstly is that the Commonwealth, I'm not able to determine the full breadth and extent of activities that are taking place in the Commonwealth. So I can't necessarily say if it has been active or not. I can speak from my own experience, and which is that from the perspective of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, where I had the opportunity last December to be a delegate and to actually get decision making done in a fictional jurisdiction. It was brilliant. It was a brilliant experience to sensitize people on parliamentary democracy, on good governance, even through negotiation. So I think in that regard, it's great. I was also had the opportunity to participate in a workshop that was provided support to new legislators to the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. So if you look at in terms of the support that is given on a local level, I think it's there. I think what happens though is that it may not market what it has been done as readily as it could, but I think it's there. Another issue is that we also have to connect what the Commonwealth is doing and the benefits of it to persons at the local level. So for example, if persons were able to connect to the research that the Commonwealth would have done and the programs that would have been facilitated to benefit people directly, then I don't think we would have had the conversation. I think where we fall off is when there's a disconnect. So we see something taking place far off and not seeing how it relates to us. So we need to provide that nexus and bridge research output with individual benefits. So that starts with, for example, highlighting reports that are done about the activities of the different branches of the Commonwealth, seeing how many people are benefiting, or looking how we can measure quantitatively the impact of it. And once we're able to measure the impact, then we'll have less of these conversations, because people can see, all right, the Commonwealth has had this workshop, this is how many persons would have benefited. So that's what we start to need going forward.
Okay, good stuff. I just want to get back to this idea of funding and public funding, if lots of things can be achieved with or without public funding. And Danish, I wondered if you had any thoughts about
that. With regards to funding, I would say that, like I earlier suggested, it could be a think tank of think tanks, just like the member legislatures in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association are required to pay an annual fee and a contribution to keep the organization running and to fund its activities. So this could be one of the ways to fund that particular think tank. And other ways could be obviously raising funds from across the Commonwealth, and there could be more developed countries that can come forward and develop a fund for running that particular think tank. So obviously, somebody also asked about the public funding all those institutions. So when you compare cost and benefits of a particular institution, and then obviously you don't mind providing or paying for that from the taxpayer funds. But one has to analyze the fact that the benefits outweigh costs. So it shouldn't be the fact that the institutions keep running on the taxpayer funds from many countries, and they don't come up with the desired results or outcomes of what they were designed and excuse me, what they were designed and established for. So in order for that to be effective, there needs to be very strict and very vibrant evaluation and monitoring mechanisms as well. There has to be a body that overall analyzes and evaluates whether the goals are being achieved or not, and not just annual evaluation. It should be periodic evaluation, say quarterly evaluation. So in order to keep assessing its performance against the standards and the goals that a particular institution is going to be established for.
Okay, lovely. Rashmi, that idea of funding, though, that is often the thing that stops lots of people looking into things and, as you say, making progress or evaluating things. That money can stop lots of people. Can we look at that question with you, Rashmi, and this idea of public funding and whether we need it or not?
Yes, public funding could also be, once again, I'll go back to the topic that public funding could also be agenda specific. Not everyone is interested in one particular topic. They also have their own interests, which are going to benefit their own business. So if David's interest is in education, then David is a right person to, collect and distribute the public funding for the causes that are involving education in the policy cycle. Similarly, the public funding is necessary, of course. Apart from that, we also need to, make the government accountable for all these efforts apart from public funding, because I think we all are paying taxes for this.
Okay. Fair enough. Thank you, Rashmi. I just want to bring in this last comment from David. He says, in addition to the 3 organisations hosting today, there are a significant number of organisations in the Commonwealth network, such as the Royal Commonwealth Society, which has branches throughout the Commonwealth. So could one or more of these serve as the coordinating body for such a think tank, rather than start a new organisation from scratch? David, any thoughts?
I think that's a good idea. If you always read my pieces, I am always for combining entities and rationalizing it and making it more efficient going forward. So I think that's a very good idea. I also think that it makes it much easier to manage, having a coordinating body. I would possibly suggest that perhaps the Secretariat, the Commonwealth Secretariat, could be an institution that should be considered for this role. And it would also make funding a lot easier, because I know funding is the big hot button issue taking place. Because I can, for example, give a Caribbean perspective on an institution that persons may have questioned, okay, how would we fund this? I would say the Caribbean Court of Justice, which is a final appellate court for issues relating to CARICOM matters. It was funded by a one-off contribution from all the different governments in CARICOM that was then invested into a trust fund managed by professionals. And after that, no government plays anything into the operations of the court, and it's able to operate at high standards. Likewise, the Commonwealth can pursue a mechanism like that, since if there's concerns relating to funding, well, a one-off pool of resources is contributed, that's invested wisely, so it can facilitate that turnover of knowledge and of resources going forward. And certainly a coordinating body is useful in that. And if we can coordinate bodies and highlight across the board the different institutions, how they work, the impact, then I think we can achieve the reforms that we were looking for within the Commonwealth.
Fantastic. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm just wondering, as we draw soon to a close, if I just would go to each of you panelists to make some final points. So if I could start with you, Karen, and if there's anything you want to add to the conversation.
Thank you, Danny. I just want to say thank you so much for involving me in this conversation, and to all of the participants and the panelists. It really has been a rich and pertinent one. And I think it's really just the beginning of this conversation. I mean, it comes at a critical time, not only in terms of the Institute itself and looking at the future of Commonwealth Studies, but looking at the relevance of the Commonwealth across its 54 member states. So I think that conversations like this should continue and should be premised on an understanding of the power relations that form our associations, but also our shared history as well, because there is beauty in it too. So I think if we start with a confrontation of that and we address that, we can move forward in a really exciting way. So I look forward to taking part in many more of these kinds of conversations.
Fantastic. Danish, have you got any more thoughts?
Yes, I would comment a little bit on the last question. Probably it was from David. I would believe there should be a dedicated institution or a think tank, because sometimes when you mention Royal Institute or say Commonwealth Parliamentary Association or Commonwealth Heads of Governments Organization, so they have their own predefined mandates. So when you overlap those mandates by some interim function, let's say, so obviously their priorities are different, their mandates are different. So somewhere that particular interim role that you assign those organizations, somewhere these goals are lost in translations. When something that you do is not a priority, obviously you don't pay as much focus and attention on that. You don't dedicate enough resources on that, because your primary mandate is something else. So in that particular context, I would still believe a dedicated institution and a dedicated think tank would always be a better option. And then all these institutions, which are already existing, they can come to their aid and support in facilitating gathering resources and connecting them with the networks and think tanks around the world. Because Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, I know and have worked in past, so they are connected with all those legislatures, and legislature is something which can even drive respective governments to come to the forefront and contribute in ensuring that because if the policy and legislation has been made, obviously government has to back that legislation, and similarly the desired goals can be achieved. And so in short, a dedicated institution aided and supported by all those existing organizations would be proving more instrumental. And other than that, I totally agree with Karen. This has been one of the most productive sessions, and I'm really excited and glad to be a part of this. And it is a start of a conversation, and I hope and look forward to the future conversations as well. And thank you very much to you and all the stakeholders involved in making this possible. Thank you.
Well, it has been a fruitful conversation. I just wonder a bit as well, if I could just also go to you, Rashmi. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we draw to a close?
Yes, I would like to add two things last, specifically directed to the Commonwealth authorities, the decision-making authorities, who are going to listen to our conversation and later decide what they are going to do. First and foremost thing is, we understand that funding bodies need result. And as Danish had earlier pointed out, that at the level of implementation, there could be some problems. But we also understand that there is no direct legal obligation to the Commonwealth countries available to the Commonwealth studies. But a good guidance is also very important. legal obligation is not always required for development. And scholars like Karin, Danish, David, me, we are going to, make our own contribution to the change. We wouldn't have been there in this platform if we wouldn't have been a Commonwealth scholar. Second point I would like to highlight that in their decision, the authorities also need to consider that in order to progress together as a human civilization, we need to make sure that we take environment and non-human species along with the human rights, so that the development is sustainable. That's it. Thank you, and thank you, Danny. It's a wonderful session.
Well, it is. It does feel like there's so much to go through, isn't there? It does feel like it is just the start of the conversation. I wonder if I could go to you though, David, because I haven't asked you for your final thoughts.
Well, I'd like to say that the wind of change is moving through the Commonwealth. I know that speech was made by Harold Macmillan when he was speaking about national consciousness taking place across different territories in the world. But I'd like to use it in the context of the wind of change in the global community. We are evaluating our positions in the world and where we are going into the future. And it is these sorts of discussions that are very important as we grapple with, I call, the crossroads of destiny for all of us going forward. So I would like to encourage all those persons who ask the questions to continue to ask very important questions. I would like to thank the organizers for this event and thank my fellow panelists, because this is a very important issue and it has implications going forward. So it's better that we channel that wind into productive beats instead of having it turn into a vortex or a hurricane of some sort. So I would like to say thank you for this opportunity, and it has been a very positive discussion.
It certainly has, and thank you to all of you for being such wonderful panelists. And of course, we must remember all of our audience who have been listening in and contributing questions and comments right around the globe. Apologies if we didn't get to your question, but rest assured, I've been told by the organisers that your questions and your comments will be retained and fed into the reflections of this event, and more importantly, into that report on the future of the Institute in Commonwealth Studies. The Commonwealth Foundation have also informed me there will be a couple of forthcoming blog posts that will further explore and deepen some of the issues discussed today, so that conversation continues. So if you're part of the Foundation's mailing list, you will receive those in your inbox in due course. If you're not, please take note of the link on the slide at the end of this webinar, and you can join that too. So I'd like to just thank all of you for talking and giving your thoughts, all the academics, all the thinkers, political analysts and future leaders of the Commonwealth for what has been a rich, fascinating and thoughtful discussion. I just want to wrap up with some of the things that we've heard then over the course of the hour and a half. Throughout this open forum, we've addressed three core questions. The first question, what should Commonwealth Studies mean today and why should it matter? We had a range of answers from all of our panelists. Commonwealth Studies should address the past while also looking to the future. It must facilitate learning and sharing and the exchange of ideas. We need to counter divisive politics. Commonwealth Studies can do this by building connections between citizens, that commonality, the dynamics of the Commonwealth, our shared past, that can act as a unifying force. Commonwealth Studies, including the study of refugee law and human rights, are more important now than ever, as some of the comments that you made. There is a backlash against democracy and democratic institutions which are undermining independent judiciaries, and strengthening institutions for policy-driven research is extremely necessary. Now, we also had questions from the audience regarding both legislation and funding. That seems to be a key one. And of course, the second question addressed what the most important issues could be or should be dealt with under that umbrella term Commonwealth Studies. And the key points covered include the following topics. We need to look at the history, the power struggles which have shaped the unequal nature of our landscape and world today. Issues that Commonwealth Studies could look at are very wide-ranging, including anything from climate change to localised, targeted focus on development. the study of procedural policy making and reviewing the implementation of policies, violent extremism, terrorism, regional conflict, the global health crisis, human rights violations, democracy promotion, gender equality, international peace and security, SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and inequalities, not least health quality in today's context, of course, that we all face now in the COVID-19 pandemic. And lastly, we asked, could the Commonwealth benefit from a think tank or similar institution dedicated to Commonwealth studies? And we asked, if so, what might that look like? Well, no think tank can be confined to London. It should operate beyond the UK. Any think tank would have to be suitably localised and able to provide practical advice to governments for policy formation. And our panellists and our audience seem to want a think tank that is focused very much on the Sustainable Development Goals and how to achieve a more equitable world. So the Commonwealth have, of course, been a significant presence in the world of politics, even just from my own take. Apartheid in South Africa, it's been key in doing key moments of our history. And because of its diverse membership, it has the capacity to help the world negotiate solutions to global problems. We've heard just a few of those today. With that, Commonwealth studies are important to university teaching and research. So I'd like to conclude by saying thank you very much for joining this critical conversation. Do look out for future critical conversations hosted by the Commonwealth Foundation. Thank you to all the panelists, all the audience. It's goodbye from me, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much.